We've had a lot of experience working with this, but we are trying to educate our investor clients on the differences of short-term rental investing versus long-term rental. So that being said, Kyle, you've had a chance to see both sides of the management business, both in long-term and short-term, especially with the background in property, home inspections. What are some of the differences that you're seeing for the type of investor for short-term management? What's the difference in how they're managed versus long-term?
So I would say, short-term rental is a lot more dynamic. There's a lot of things that may not be in your control. Things could be going quite smoothly, for weeks, months at a time, and then all of a sudden there's a big wrench that's just dropped. Grenade goes off, and then you got to pick up the pieces and you got to deal with it. But I would say that's probably the biggest thing between long-term and short-term. Like short-term rental, you got to be on your game all the time. It's hospit forward, and you got to please the guests. That's rule number one.
So it's a little bit different. In long-term, problems can occur. They're usually unexpected. So it's usually long periods of quiet with bursts of sudden activity when we're dealing with long-term management, where it seems like with short-term management for investors, it's a little bit of a faster moving vehicle, and therefore there's more likely to see those little blips. So it's the same thing. You'll probably have 8 or 9 guests and everything is smooth and clean. And all of a sudden you have that one guest where all of a sudden something pops up and you got to deal with it.
Yeah. It all comes down to, the systems that you have in place. If you don't have good systems in place for an SDR, you're going to be in a world of hurting.
So for someone who's looking, like when you're saying, for someone who's interested in owning a short-term rental asset, what should they be prepared for? Especially we've onboarded some new ones. So we've had some recent experience in bringing some new clients on board. Tell me a little bit about some of that experience with kind of training them up to understand the expectations of how short-term rentals are managed.
So, I mean, if we're handling everything from a property management perspective, I don't know if that's what you're getting at, or just a landlord in general taking it on themselves.
I'm thinking more for it could be either, but for us, for general, if someone's coming to us and says, "Hey, Chris and Kyle, I'd like to turn my property into a short-term rental, and I want you guys to manage it." Maybe they have some experience in long-term rental, and this is completely new. So I'm kind of like talking on some of the points of how things are a little bit different from this end of the business, from a landlord perspective.
So one of the biggest things I would say is you really need to try to front load your information to guests, right? So guests shouldn't have to be digging around looking for information. It should be readily available to them. So for us, like we use, let's just say Airbnb, VRBO, for example, those platforms have their information built into it that's accessible to guests. But then that's one option. Second, we send them individual messages. Again, redundancy with information. Third, we have a PDF house manual for all of the properties that goes directly to the guests. They have everything they need right out of the gate. And that's important because if the guests can get the information they need, they don't need to reach out to you to find out, the information for the house.
Sure.
So that's one of the most important things, is having redundancy in your communication, thinking about what could go wrong premeditatively, right? Have an idea. What can go wrong with this place? What can I do to make sure it doesn't happen again? Put in a system in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's important.
And so another interesting thing here is, like, between long-term and short-term, when you're dealing with long-term, if we're onboarding a new client, bringing them into the fold for long-term management, there's typically a peak of, like, we're going to do some work on the property, make some replacements at the time it moves in, and usually, again, long periods of quiet before maybe there's some maintenance and repairs that are ongoing. But when it comes to short-term rentals management for landlords, this is a completely different ballgame because there's ongoing consumables and wear and tear. So talk to me a little bit about the differences you're seeing in some of the physical plant wear and tear versus the consumable, I don't want to say wear and tear, but costs for short-term rental investors.
So your consumables are going to be linens and towels. They're probably going to be the big ones. You might not expect that out of the gate, but in the market that we're serving, we turn places quite frequently. So you're probably going to get 6 months at best a year, out of your linens and towels. So one, wear and tear, but two, people just like to take towels, apparently. Bath towels, washcloths, hand towels, you name it. They'll walk out the door with it. So
But they don't take sheets, but they take hand towels.
The towels, man. I'm telling you, it's the towels. Sheets get stained. And then they're gone.
I wonder sometimes if it's like, they get makeup on them so they feel guilty, just throw them in their cleaning kit, or like, I don't know, or if it's just like it goes in the laundry pile at that point, just throw everything in and off we go. But it is odd to me that like why people like to take towels. But yes, that is a consumable, and therefore it is something that it has a shelf life. What I mean by that is you're putting that money out there, you will not get that back. It's a somewhat fixed cost that you have to expect as part of your operations.
It's a part of doing business as an STR.
Yeah. It's a part of doing business as a short-term rental. And it's true, right? Because we don't, if you have a time, go onto like a YouTube and watch like, when things get out of hand at hotels and they're dealing with the same problems, guests out of control or doing damages, like no matter what you're investing in, whether it's long-term, middle-term, short-term, vacation rentals, corporate rentals, there's risk with everything. There's no guarantees. Well, that's not true. I guess there are some minimals you could get, but the more guaranteed the money, the lower the return you're going to get.
Yeah.
The lower the risk, the lower the return. Because that's just how it works. The higher the risk, the higher the return. So for us, we're realizing that there's a certain investor or mental makeup for someone to be able to deal with the fact that this is a moving target. So we talked about control. And if you like peace of mind, you like to feel a little bit more of control, and you like the idea of setting and forgetting, long-term rentals probably more likely your best investment vehicle. But if you have flexibility, you can handle a little bit more risk, you're willing to take on some more of those challenges, if you can let go from the control, short-term rental might be a worthwhile investment for you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's tough. It's tough talking about this because, you never know who's listening or what kind of person they're coming after. But what I will say is that most of our short-term rental owners are, again, they're just accidental owners who have a property with either a great rate or maybe there's no money owed on it. And they want to know how can they maximize their return on investment. Now, when it comes to short-term rental, they can make more money, but it also requires more moving parts. And a lot of that comes with the customer service. Tell me a little bit about the amount of time, energy, and effort required for this, because these guests are expecting the experience as opposed to a long-term rental where they might wait 2 or 3 days for their HVAC to get fixed.
Right. So, I mean, that right there is probably the biggest piece of it, dealing with the guests, right? Guest communication. But again, it all comes down to the systems that you have in place, right? So we've begun using AI, much like several other people. Huge time saver, right? So there's a lot of redundant messages that we can have AI take care of for us. When somebody books a schedule, right? An automatic confirmation message will go out to the guest. Those things save you a ton of time in the short-term rental market.
And so it's systems. And just like everything, like there's competition everywhere. That doesn't mean there's not room for you to play in the waters. And just like anything, there are good businesses and there are bad businesses. They're all there, right? I've driven up and down 95 to Florida to PA, I think 3 or 4 times in the last 2 years. Freaking hotels and motels everywhere. They're all over the place. So there's clearly there's not so much corporate business that there's no room left for the little person, the little investor, so to speak, the smaller mom and pop investor. But just like the fact that there are hundreds of properties lining up and down 95 on the East Coast, well, guess what? Some of them are really, really well run and others aren't. So it's just like anything else. You have to put yourself in the perspective of the client, of the guest or the tenant, and ask, what would you want? Because I find a lot of investors only look at how they want things to work, and they're not looking at it from the guest or tenant's perspective.
Yeah. No, 100%. You're in a 100% service-based industry, so you need to do whatever you can to please the guests. But the one thing that's important to remember is, as much as you want somebody to see the world through your eyes, it's never going to happen, and you just need to be open to that.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, no matter what you do, and no matter how well you do it, there's potentially someone out there who's going to try to game the system.
Well, I have a perfect example of that. So
let's talk about that.
So just the other day, we had a guest who reached out to us at 7:30 in the morning, and they were only staying for 2 nights. Their reservation was for 2 nights. They spent 1 night. We got a message at 7:30 in the morning saying that in the middle of the night, a soap dispenser, a plastic soap dispenser, fell off of the wall in the shower. As a result of that, it landed on the bathroom floor and it broke into some pieces, again, being plastic. And as a result of that incident, they felt as though it was best to leave the property, and they didn't feel safe being in the property anymore. And they actually filed a complaint through Airbnb that there was a safety hazard with our property as a result of this. So mind you, we received this message at 7:30. Less than an hour later, we had somebody out there to take care of it. They cleaned up the plastic. Everything was fine. Well, a little bit later in the day, 12 hours later, the guest requests a refund for that night. What are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? So our perspective with that particular situation is not much of a safety hazard. Right? You have a piece of plastic that fell off a wall. It was cleaned up within an hour of it being reported. The interesting thing here is when our contractors showed up to take care of it, the guests already had their bags packed at the door. They're ready to go. Is it a scam? I don't know. Did they decide that, hey, we don't need this? We don't need to, our plans changed. We don't need the place for the second night. So how can we get out of it?
Right. That's what I'm thinking is more likely, is just, how do I get out of that? And that's what I'm saying. That's why I feel it's so silly. And I understand that these platforms, and I am not a big fan of sharecropping on other companies' platforms, because they can just change the rules arbitrarily, and you're subject to, like, I'm not speaking bad against our Facebook overlords, Mark Zuckerberg, but if you've got a problem with Facebook, good luck. You're on your own. There's nothing you can do. Same thing with YouTube. If an issue happens and you lose a channel, like we had another brokerage under another brand, and we were given videos by the company to use on our YouTube channels. Somewhere it triggered, because so many people across the country are using them, that these were copyright infringements, and just close the channel down. Just shut it down. And there's nothing you can do. There was no one to appeal to, because you're working on somebody else's platform. So when we're dealing with, let's call it the big elephant in the room, Airbnb, followed up by VRBO, those companies have their own processes for dealing with complaints. If you want to be in the short-term rental space, you have to be able to deal with the frustration that the corporate overlords may not see these requests the way that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that Airbnb has a tendency to side with the guest.
The guest. And in some cases, when you read about certain horrible things that happen, you're like, yeah, you should be on the side of the guest. But in what world is a soap dispenser coming off? And this is all part of the whole saving money, these ridiculous, soap, shampoo, and conditioner things. I mean, I don't know. When I used to travel to places and beach houses, we would bring our own amenities. But I guess if you want some free shampoo, okay, I'll get you some free shampoo.
And right. I mean, and that's an option that we have, right? We could decide, hey, we're not going to provide that.
Yeah.
That problem go away. I myself, if I go to stay at an Airbnb, I'm going to bring my own stuff. Like, if they have it there, great. It's nice. If you forget, you have something to use. But, if a soap dispenser fell off the wall when I'm at a place, I'm not going to go complaining about it.
You stay in so many hotels, and I've had air conditioners stop working, and they'll move you to another room. But I've never been right off the gate like, hey, I used everything, but this one thing didn't work right. Give me a full refund. And it's part of our culture now that it's a little frustrating. It's just, again, this is something that you as an investor have to be prepared for, that there's going to be times where I was telling you, Kyle, last week about a story like, where we filed, and we had the receipts, the bona fide photos and receipts to repair the damage, showing like $430, and Airbnb just arbitrarily says, we'll give you $300. You just have to eat that 130, 135 on the chin, and there's nothing you can do about it. So in the beginning, we would get super frustrated. Now we take more of the Kyle Fisher calm approach, which is it's cost of doing business.
Sometimes, in the situation that I just shared, sometimes you just have to take it on the chin, right? It's ridiculous. The claim's ridiculous. Look at the overall cost, right? Was night, let's just say $200 or less. Is it worth paying that to that client to potentially stave off a bad review?
Yeah, and that's the problem. We can't guarantee staving off that bad review. That's the biggest frustration. Is that you can try to say, hey, listen, if we give you that refund, but then it becomes like a standoff, right? Everyone's got a gun pointed at each other. Like, well, if you give a review, then I'll give the money, but only if you do it first. And it's like, it's not a fun experience, and you shouldn't want it to be that way. But I would say, after having done this for almost 2 years now, I would say that we have seen that it is 80 to 90% of the guests are doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, and they're the best kind of guests, right? They follow the rules. They communicate well. They don't complain. They leave. We send them a review request. They give us a good review. We comment on the review, and everybody's happy.
Everybody's happy.
80 to 90%, I would say, goes that way. But every once in a while, you have your Karens.
80 to 90% of the people will put the grocery carts back where they belong. 80 to 90% of people will open the door for someone right behind them. 80 to 90% of people who catch a fair ball near a child will give it to a child, right? But there's always that 10 to 20%. And I'm going to cut that video in where the woman reaches over and grabs the ball from the child's hand, right? These people exist. Yeah. These people exist, and we have to remember we live and walk amongst them. And you can lose your mind and get frustrated, or you can learn to do it. And by the way, in the beginning, Kyle, you probably did the same thing from your business background too. Like, there are times when you don't want to give those refunds. You want every dollar. You want to save as much, but then there's maturity in business when you realize, you know what? It's cheaper for me to give that refund and buy back the amount of time and aggravation and hopefully not getting this negative parent train on my business than to hold out on principle.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, especially with SDR. If you have a new property, right, you just listed it, you cannot take a bad review out of the gate. You can't. You have to build up some 5-star reviews. For every 1-star review on Airbnb, you need about 5 5-star reviews to erase it.